Then.
Well, welcome everybody, and welcome particularly to our guest speakers this evening, Melanie Nazareth, Cleo Lake and Jonathon Porritt, who's one of our patrons, and also welcome remotely to Bishop James Jones, who's also another of our patrons. Just a little tiny bit of housekeeping. Please use speaker view and then you'll get a good view of anyone who is speaking. You won't get lots and lots of little pictures. Please stay muted, and this session is being recorded. So Jeremy, I'm going to hand over to you now. Welcome.
Good, I've just unmuted myself. Welcome everybody. It's great to have you all here for the opening session of the festival on reimagining the Promised Land. And we have some inspiring contributors with us to kick off our discussion and get started on the topic. So the way it's going to work for this evening is each of our speakers is going to have a few minutes to respond to the topic, and then we'll go into a time of discussion. And there's quite a lot of us, so we're not going to open up to questions from the floor, but if you have a question, then drop it in the chat function there, and our hosts, Barbara and Deborah, will send through any questions that seem particularly relevant, and we'll see if we can get to those by the end. Before we start, we're going to have a recorded message from Bishop James Jones, who can't be with us this evening, but he's recorded one. Many of you will know Bishop James as a long-standing patron of Green Christian, I believe, and an advocate of social justice and the environment, and former Bishop of Liverpool as well. So if you could play that video, Ruth, that will kick us off.
Hello, I'm really sorry not to be with you live today, and I hope you'll accept this recorded message as my contribution to this important gathering, reimagining the Promised Land. I love this poem, which is to be found in Bede's History of the English People. Praise we the fashioner now of heaven's fabric, the majesty of his might and his mind's wisdom, work of the world warden, worker of all wonders, how he, the Lord of glory everlasting, wrought first for the race of men heaven as a roof tree, then made he middle earth to be their mansion. I would love to add a line to the creed. After saying that we believe in the resurrection of the body, I would love to add, we believe in the earthing of heaven, because that is the Promised Land, and it's what we pray for every time we say the Lord's Prayer. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, the earthing of heaven. Although I often prefer the older version, which talks about thy will being done in earth as it is in heaven, because that little preposition in suggests that God's will is to be done not just on the surface of the earth, but in the deep ecology of the world. I sometimes feel that we are caught between two forces. That force that prays and works for the earthing of heaven, and a sinister force that is about the earthing of hell. I urge you to watch David Attenborough's witness statement, which he's filmed on Netflix, because it is his assessment of what we are now doing to the earth, and it is nothing short of the earthing of hell. Interestingly, in the Gospels, the word for hell is Gehenna, and it comes from the word Hinnom and the Valley of Hinnom, which was the municipal rubbish dump outside the walls of Jerusalem, a smouldering heap. And when Jesus used that image, it was as if he was saying to people, look, if you carry on living in this way, you will waste your lives and you will turn everything into some great rubbish dump. And those images were extraordinarily prescient, because that is exactly what we are doing today. By living in the self-centered way that we are in effect turning the earth into some great rubbish dump. We are polluting the atmospheres. We are poisoning the rivers and the oceans. We are contaminating the land. We are earthing hell. One image that strikes me very powerfully is the Thames Barrier, which was built to protect London from flooding. Well, the Thames Barrier went up 4 times in the 1980s, 35 times in the 1990s, and up until this moment, 2020, it has been raised some 200 times. And it crosses my mind that if the City of London, with its financial institutions at the centre of the world's economy, and if the Palace of Westminster, the heart of our constitutional democracy, if these 2 places had been flooded as many times as the Thames Barrier has been raised, then we would be taking much more urgent action on climate change and environmental degradation. So why should Christians be concerned? Well, very simply, that desecrating God's creation is undoing God's creative work in, through, and for Christ. And it is nothing short of a blasphemy. Yes, it's a crime against humanity and future generations, but it is also an act of not just defiance, but of rebellion against God's creative purposes. Interestingly, also, Jesus in the Gospels, whenever he talks about his own mission, he more often than not calls himself the child of the earth. Well, you might say, I've never seen that before. Well, you won't have, because the translations that we read have him describing himself as the Son of Man. But in Hebrew, that Son of Man means child of the one hewn from the earth. And there's a unique collection of sayings in the Gospels where Jesus calls himself the Son of Man, the child of the earth, and in the same breath talks about the earth. For example, thinking of his future and his own crucifixion, Jesus says, just as Jonah was in the belly of the whale 3 days and 3 nights, so the Son of Man, the child of the earth, will be in the heart of the earth. And at his crucifixion, for they lay him in the heart of the earth quakes. And then on the 3rd day, when God raises him from the heart of the earth quakes again. And that speaks to me that the earth could not remain silent as it saw the child of the earth being crucified, bringing about the salvation of the world. And it says also that that salvation is not just about the saving of individuals, but it is also about the rescuing and restoring of the earth itself. Jesus also said, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." I love that promise because it speaks of people who are humble in their relationship with God, in their relationship with the earth, and with one another. But I love it also because it is Jesus himself reimagining the promised land. It is Jesus thinking into the future and seeing a future for the earth itself. And that's also clear when, shortly before his own trial and passion, he talks about when he will come again, looking into the future. He speaks of the Son of Man, the child of the earth, coming in glory when? At the renewal of all things. Jesus saw himself as central to reimagining the promised land. Lots of people love that poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins, God's Grandeur. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. Later on in the poem, he says something very significant. He writes, "And for all this, nature is never spent." Why? Because there lives the dearest freshness deep down things. And that verse speaks to me about how the human family is a part of nature and not apart from it. It speaks to me of how within the natural world the human family has its part to play. And we bring to the whole of nature human ingenuity, human conscience, and the human spirit. I'm so pleased that Jonathon has agreed to be a part of this festival, because he's written a brilliant book called Hope in Hell, which charts just how we, the human family, can play our part as a part of nature to restore nature. And I urge you to get and to read that book. Hopkins ends his poem, of course, by looking to God and to God's own commitment to his creation, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breast and with our bright wings. It's our invitation to work now, steering us away from the earthing of hell to the earthing of heaven. I look forward so much to hearing the outcome of the discussions and the workshops, and I wish you God's blessing as you reimagine the promised land. Over to you, Jonathon.
Okay, so thank you to Bishop James there, who was introducing Jonathon, but we have actually changed the order around and it's not going to be Jonathon next. Next, we're going to hear from Cleo. Cleo Lake is a former Lord Mayor of Bristol and an elected councillor and an MEP candidate for the Green Party. Cleo is an advocate for social justice and a presenter of the African AF podcast, which stands for African as Future, and a powerful voice for African heritage communities in Britain and beyond as well. And it's great to have you with us, Cleo. I'll hand over to you for a few minutes to respond to the topic.
Thank you very much, Germany, and I'm happy to be here tonight. And I really enjoyed listening to Bishop James there, who I felt gave us a good centre to start our discussions tonight. And I hope it will be a discussion where we can discuss our thoughts, our feelings, and perhaps come to some tangible solutions as well. If I can, I would start on a bit of a personal note by saying that I'm not entirely sure if I am a Christian. I do have faith. I have attended church in my life, and I do attend church here and there. Of course, I attended church many times when I was the Lord Mayor of Bristol, which I absolutely enjoyed. My mother, who I describe as white British, whatever that really means, she was born in Hove and grew up in Staffordshire, rural Staffordshire, and is definitely part Scots Canadian. But she, whilst I was growing up, she would describe herself as actually atheist until in recent years converting to Islam. However, throughout that journey, she's always been a humanitarian and always been someone who's been an advocate for nature and for animals besides ourselves, and really respecting animals and nature. So I've had that in me from a very young age. My father, I describe as a proud African man born in Jamaica, and he passed away when I was quite young. And whilst he also would perhaps shy away or move away deliberately from Christianity, most of his family and some of my upbringing was strongly Pentecostal. My father did buy me a gold cross as a child, despite his skepticism of Christianity. And I mention this because his wariness of it was stemming from his childhood in Jamaica and the attitude, perhaps, of some of the leaders of the church and of how the doctrines were forced upon people. It was only fairly recently that I came to understand, perhaps a few decades after his death, that he was more interested in traditional practices that have the root in Africa, but had traveled over to the Caribbean and had kept some of its essence, things that actually really connect people with nature and the cosmos, things that try not to separate from nature and the cosmos. So I just wanted to give you that bit of background. In terms of thinking about the Promised Land, well, I tried to Google it, of course, and it is sort of obviously a phrase I've heard of, and I have my own notion of it in my head. I actually asked my partner, who is a Catholic from Ghana, and he started telling me all about a story about Moses. And I said, that may be relevant somewhere, but I'm not sure if that is the focus of tonight's discussion. I was convinced it was more talking about how we can move forward and develop a new, positive, normal out of the circumstances we find ourselves in. I also reflected, I'm a reggae music fan. Perhaps I would be, being half Jamaican. Anyway, there is a reggae icon, now deceased, called Dennis Emmanuel Brown, and he has quite a famous song called The Promised Land. And I looked through the lyrics, and there's just a couple of lines that really stood out to me, which are, there's plenty of land for you and I, by and by, lots of food to share for everyone, no time for segregation in the Promised Land. And I think that does capture a lot of how I feel about how we do need to move forward. I understand that a focus tonight is also about the environment, but I feel that we cannot separate social justice from environmental justice, and whether that is at home or abroad. Those few lines make me think of things like food and land sovereignty. I'm slightly encouraged by our fellow UK citizens there in Scotland, who have in recent years managed to put through land reform bills, which actually go some way to sharing land and distributing wealth in a more equitable manner, i.e., telling some of the dukes and people in elite positions that it is no longer acceptable to sit in your mansion on acres and acres of land while other people struggle to have a roof over their head. Surely in 2020, those days must be gone. Equally, isn't it a disgrace that children, adults, and elders will go hungry here in the UK when we are, on paper, one of the richest nations on the planet? I find it entirely shocking. I'm sure you do too. And of course, the essence of Christianity is about caring and sharing. Caring and sharing about each other and about the environment, because we cannot survive if we do not have an environment intact, if we do not protect Mother Nature. Reflecting on our situation through COVID, and as a local councillor, I've seen that some things have did slow down. In many ways, we were slowly regressing back entirely to how things were. But there was a period where people were really appreciating the outdoors, appreciating open spaces, appreciating air that was a little cleaner, and that is important. And also, my council here in Bristol and other councils up and down the country were doing more to open up roads, for example, to accommodate more pedestrians and cyclists. That is still happening, but I'm not sure how long or how far it will go. A little bit back to my culture and heritage as an African heritage person, born in the UK, with also Caribbean heritage. Again, through reggae music and discussions and things I overhear from my elders, many of them from the Rastafarian community, who of course do share the same scriptures, there are ideas and phrases that are passed down to us. Things like missionaries turned up in our places of origin, or the places that we were. They gave us the Bible and took our land and took our lives. Through that period, there was ecocide and genocide. And the legacy of that is something that is still very much with us today, through rife global inequality, discrimination, and everything else. We all know about this, and we've seen an element of this rise up alongside COVID through Black Lives Matter, for example, as well as, perhaps more positive, the reparations movement. A reparations movement that believes that we desperately all need to heal from the painful past. We need to face up to it, heal from it, and that we cannot mitigate the natural disasters that are heading our way if we cannot repair from this. In fact, holistic African reparations are a gateway to planetary repairs. Just a few more notes, and I agree with what Bishop James said, that we have been actively encouraged in society to become individuals, self-centered, and in many ways to care and to share and to go above and beyond for others is running against the tide that is fed to us quite often. So the challenges are there. But the repercussions are going to be severe if we don't mitigate this and if we do not promote change. And whilst the global south, which is least responsible for the mess that the planet is in, it is likely to be hit hardest. But as we also heard from Bishop James, the UK is not exempt from natural disaster. And it shouldn't be a case of out of sight and out of mind. Life is a blessing. Nature is a blessing. The resilience of nature is outstanding. I walk down my street surrounded by concrete, and yet the buddleia, the dandelions, and all other manner and host of living plants still survive. And I take heart from that. So let's act collectively now and attempt to rein ourselves in. We're all guilty to some extent. We're all sat here as hypocrites to some extent. We have to put our hands up. And I also think that we have to humble ourselves. We have to seek counsel from places that perhaps we haven't before, or that we aren't usually inclined to. And I would suggest we should be reaching out actively to First Nation people, earth protectors who have been holding the fort for generations. When will we get out of our own way to hear and heed their calls. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Cleo. Next, we're going to hear from Melanie Nazareth, a lawyer whose life took an unexpected turn recently, and she's now an activist with Extinction Rebellion and Christian Climate Action. I've personally been struck by Melanie's ability to balance the urgency of direct action and the climate emergency with a more contemplative approach and a real honesty about the grief and the sadness of the climate emergency. And Melanie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And hello to everyone. It's really lovely to be here amongst you. It kind of makes me smile in my heart to know that you all care enough about what's happening on this planet to spend your Friday evening with us thinking about it. And I'm really honoured to be doing this thinking with such distinguished co-panelists. I feel completely out of my depth in this company. But I'm going to get stuck in and do my best. And one of the questions that I was asked to think about, and the one that I'm going to respond to, is how can we rekindle our imaginations and find inspiration for a new narrative to energize us? And in doing this, mine is also a very personal contribution to this debate, and it picks up on many of the themes that Cleo has spoken so passionately about. But I'm going to do the thinking by telling a story and introducing myself in a bit more detail. It's going to be a sort of geographical tour of my life. But that geography is also the setting for some stories that I, or maybe actually together tonight, that I can be a we, kind of need to listen to carefully in order to reimagine. And not just reimagine, that's not really enough, but to recreate or co-create the promised land. The beginning, as so often in stories, is in the way, way back. My family roots are in India, in the ex-Portuguese colony of Goa. And somewhere around 4 centuries ago, we became Christians. In fact, we were part of a forced conversion and a cultural annihilation in the 16th century. And we were then subject to the Goan Inquisition in the 17th century, all of which raises quite complex thoughts and emotions for me around my faith. But, well, that's a story for another day. Okay. I am, though, therefore, part of a minority religious group in an India that is plagued by the politics of nationalism, populism, division, and violence. And this type of politics is becoming ever more prevalent across the world. And I think that that's one of the very grave dangers that my children will face as our world is overtaken by the consequences of climate change. And so I ask myself, how do I respond to that? I'm not going to offer any answers, I'm just asking that question. I wasn't in fact born in Goa. I was actually born in Kenya, where my grandparents had moved to. And it was then a British colony. And that legacy, the ongoing economic, social, and political cost of colonialism, is another thing that I think bedevils our world today. It's not only the resulting economic and racial injustices, but also the continuing disregard and loss of indigenous stewardship and knowledge that would in fact help us to preserve our increasingly degraded ecological systems and to help us meet the climate crisis that we're facing. And that climate crisis is much on my mind because I spent the majority of my childhood in the Solomon Islands in the Western Pacific, which was then another British colony back in the day. The people of those islands, who are traditionally subsistence farmers and fishermen, contribute very, very little, if anything, to the existential threat of the climate and ecological crisis. And they never really have. but nevertheless, they're in the front line of its destructiveness. For them, rising sea levels mean that islands which have sustained the lives of whole communities have already had to be abandoned. And this is what our drive for production and consumption are seeking to make ourselves increasingly comfortable and insulated from the natural world around us. That's what it means in reality. And I think our society needs to look this in the eye and own to it before we can think about what to do. Later, I was an impressionable adolescent and young adult in Hong Kong in the late 1970s and early 80s. And that was, in fact, for me, the start of a lifelong love affair with Chinese art and food and so much more. But China is one of the climate change bad boys. China's economy remains heavily dependent on coal. And China's investment in coal worldwide is hugely inconsistent with the Paris Agreement global warming limits. On the other hand, modern China has managed to raise about 85% of its people out of extreme poverty in the last 3 or 4 decades. And they've done that with that reliance on fossil fuels. And if you look at historic emissions, that is cumulative emissions per person, the UK in fact shoots close to the top of the rankings, while China in fact drops downwards to the bottom. And if you allocate a carbon budget that equally apportions carbon between the nations of the world, in direct proportion to the population of each country, you could argue that China has only used to date about 20%, 28%, 30% of its carbon budget, while the UK is overdrawn by more than 2.5 times. So how can we act justly and love mercy and walk humbly with God if we use up any more of that carbon budget? Just as an aside, for those who aren't familiar with that phrase, if you turn in your Bible to Micah 6:8, you'll find it. But here I am now, deeply grateful to have my home in a safe and stable country that's enabled me and my family to flourish. Here's the crunch. I've found myself increasingly driven to ask, at whose cost has that flourishing been bought? And it's a tough question. And so to the Promised Land, the story of those places of where I've come from to get here, they say to me that I can't live in the Promised Land. In fact, there cannot be that Promised Land if all those places are not a part of it. And I have to work for the Promised Land. And because my stories tell me that we're moving away from it, that work is urgent. And my stories are of work that acknowledges and actively tries to repair the harms of the past, that actively tries to combat the prejudices and the intolerances of the present, and that actively tries to protect and fairly share the bounty of the earth for the future. I wondered if my story needed an ending, a how as well as a why and a when. And I used the word actively when I described the work that I needed to do. And I chose it because my how is the activist movement of Extinction Rebellion and Christian climate action. And in XR and CCA, I found a toolbox of love and hope, commitment, community, faith, and a supply of beautiful accomplices, some of whom are here tonight, with whom to co-create this reimagined Promised Land. Today, holding vigil for our broken earth, together with 11 of them, I spent much of the day in prayer on the pavement outside Parliament. And I suppose that's less of an ending and more of a step on an ongoing journey, but I guess that's how it is. So that is my story, but each of you will have your own story, the story that you can tell about who you are, that will inspire you and maybe inspire others along the way to reimagine and to co-create the promised land. So yeah, find your story and use it well. So that's me over and out.
Thank you, Melanie. That's two extraordinary stories there. Thank you for that. So we're going to move on to Jonathon now. Jonathon, I think you have quite a tough act to follow after those two stories, but you probably know Jonathon through his work with the Green Party, or Friends of the Earth, or Forum for the Future, or the Sustainable Development Commission, or through one of his books. Jonathon has pursued sustainability through politics and through government and through business and through much else besides. He's an author, and one of the books that I was thinking of was this one, which is an imaginative exercise like the kind that we're pursuing during this festival, really, to sort of imagine the future from 2050. And then more recently, the book Hope in Hell, which came out a few weeks ago and talks more specifically about our current predicament. And so thank you for being with us, Jonathon, and over to you.
Jeremy, thank you very much indeed. And yeah, like the others, absolutely delighted to be part of the proceedings this evening. And it's wonderful listening to those stories and listening to Bishop James. It's very inspiring, actually, to think about that. I'm struck by the degree to which what we're currently experiencing under COVID-19 is about as far from any kind of promised land as one could possibly be. And for an awful lot of people, this land is already pretty blighted and pretty unjust in the ways in which their opportunities have been foreshortened, the ways in which no one seems to recognize that lockdown for some people means an absolute horror story. And it's difficult against that backdrop to think about it rekindling our imagination. But thank you, Jeremy, for flagging up the world we made, because I spent quite a lot of my life at that time with the world we made, trying to get people to think very positively about what the world would look like in 2050 if we got our act together and did all the things that we need to do, from both a climate justice and a social justice perspective. And it was liberating to be able to create enough space in my own life to think about how astonishing a world we could still have by 2050, and we still can. And the problem for me, of course, was then, when writing Hope in Hell, was that that was the very opposite. It wasn't really about how wonderful the world would look. It was actually how dreadful the world will look unless we begin to move very fast indeed. And I'm struck by this issue of speed, because we don't really have as much time as most people think we have. And I do think Extinction Rebellion has done a fantastic job in actually giving people a sense of what that real urgency looks like. A lot of people have recognized that climate change is a seriously big thing for us to face, but they never properly owned that notion of what the climate emergency meant. And now I think we get it differently. I think we understand this now, which is why I've talked about this decade as being the key decade. And of course, people now have said, well, if this is going to be the key decade, then this is the key year, because as governments around the world spend trillions of pounds, euros, dollars, whatever, literally trillions. The estimate now is it'll be somewhere between 12 and 14 trillion US dollars will go into rebuilding our economies. If that flow of money is allocated in responsible, sustainable, just ways, then the prospects for 2030 look much better. And if the prospects for 2030 look much better, then the prospects for 2050 and so on look much better as well. So this year becomes absolutely crucial. But it's also the case, of course, that we don't just have a relatively short period of time to do what we need to do to avoid runaway climate change. And happily, no one this evening has as yet laid out the nightmarish vision of what runaway climate change looks like, and I don't intend to either. But we only have that period of time to change the narrative. And I'm really interested in this whole theme this evening about changing the narrative and making things so much more easily accessible for people than they are today. And that's what I mean. I don't actually think we are rekindling people's imagination. I think we're kindling it up. For so many years, decades, in fact, people's imagination about a better world has been constrained by being forced to live in a growth-bound, growth-first consumerist society, which has blighted our imagination and made it very difficult for people to talk about alternative, let alone better futures. For me, that whole story about an alternative narrative has been shaped very, very markedly by the work of Thomas Berry, who has been, for me, an absolutely inspirational person and teacher for many, many years. And his work, I think, helped me understand that although I would usually feel much more comfortable in a secular, rational, science-based world, that was never going to give people a true sense of a different narrative at all. And actually listening to Cleo was really interesting because, of course, Thomas Berry was very clear as to where he drew his inspiration from and what he saw as the different kinds of inspiration that we needed to draw on. And he basically, when he talked about wisdom, he talked about 4 different sources of wisdom. And the first, Cleo, was exactly that, the wisdom of indigenous people and the contribution they have made to a deeper understanding of relationships between humankind and life on Earth as a whole. His second source of wisdom was the wisdom of women and the degree to which that would contribute to a world which has been written largely to demonstrate the wisdom or the lack of wisdom of men. His third source, of course, was this whole question about a more revelatory set of experiences regarding the presence of God in people's lives, whether that is a transcendent God or immanent God, whatever it might be. Coming back to Thomas Berry's principle, I think, insight into what we're looking at today, with us seeing the universe as the primary revelation of God's purpose here on Earth. And then lastly, of course, he was not slow to mention the wisdom of science. He was perfectly clear that it is really crucial to base whatever views we might have on spiritually enriched narratives with a deep understanding of science, and that these two things go hand in hand. That, I think, is a really crucial part of trying to understand what a spiritual approach to this notion of servant leadership might look like now. And there are many, many people who talk about that very movingly these days, and we can really get to grips with all of that. My sort of provocation for this evening's deliberation is this, really, and it's the degree to which people are prepared to be as upfront from a political point of view as they need to be, given these insights. So I was fascinated recently to come across the the COVID-19 statement from the World Council of Churches, which was something of an eye-opener, really, because it put things in very stark terms that very often you don't hear in ecumenical statements of a similar kind. So this is what a WCC statement sounds like. We're living in apocalyptic terms and are reminded that the term apocalypse means to unveil or uncover. In moments such as this, COVID-19 is absolutely not the great leveler, not at all. It is the great revealer. In its light, we see anew and afresh the distorted realities and inequalities that powerful interests have passed off as normal and unquestionable for the last few decades. COVID-19 could become the great leveler if we harness its revelation for a transformation which raises up those who have been cast down by exploitative, supremacist, and colonial systems. Now, I feel very comfortable personally with a statement of that kind, and it seems to me to speak to this notion of the need for a new militancy in that regard. And I don't find any difficulty in that. I've never seen anything that stands in the way of that being central to the future of the Green Movement. In fact, I've often been reminded, listening to James earlier this evening when he talked very movingly about the desecration of God's creation, for as long as I can remember as a green activist, and certainly going back to the Green Party and Friends of the Earth in the 70s and 80s, many activists that I shared experiences with at that time would talk without any hesitation at all of the sacred in their relationship with the natural world and the destruction of what they saw as that sacred quality. Now, they might not have described that as a religious or even a spiritual experience, but there's no doubt that that's what it was doing with them. And I think Alistair McIntosh has touched on that in his, I think, still wonderful book, Spiritual Activism, in which he does touch on this need to take a much more activist orientation. The deeper one's spiritual insights go, the more important it is to think about the activist side of that, not just to develop holistic world views with an active spirituality at their heart, but to turn that into a commitment in our daily lives and in our work as activists. So if there is a promised land out there, it's one in which this diversity of views can be celebrated and in which we can bring forward some wonderful, powerful new insights into what we as individuals and we as communities can do together to make that promised land more of a reality.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. There's so much in those 4 statements, it's hard to know where to start to pull anything out. So just as a starting point, is there anything that you want to respond to that one of the others have said? I can see you all on the screen, so if we do hands up, then I can call on you school style. Was there anything that you wanted to respond to from each other there?
Well, I'd love to ask Melanie, is this all right, Jeremy? Can I ask Melanie a question?
Yeah, carry on.
So, Melanie, I think I understand the role that you play in Extinction Rebellion and find that really a critical part of it. I just wonder from your perspective, how Extinction Rebellion as a whole, as a collective of people, has responded to that understanding of spiritual or religious contributions. Has this been an easy integration? And I only ask that because there have been parts of my life and my career where integrating a spiritual dimension has not been easy. Indeed, exactly the opposite. So I'm fascinated to know how you've experienced that personally.
I think that one of the things that really drew me to Extinction Rebellion was its deeply spiritual quality. So I kind of fell into it in the April Rebellion, and I was immediately drawn to how it felt that the values of the movement were very similar to my spiritual values. And I think that actually that was deliberate. I think its founders have within them a deep spirituality, even if it's not kind of expressively Christian. But it's more than that now, because of course we've kind of formed a coalition of faith groups, and we work together as the Extinction Rebellion Faith Bridge. So there's an express spirituality as well about it. And the movement has been completely welcoming of that. And I think it's because it comes from a place of love. It's in its kind of founding vision statement, is that it's born of love for this planet and all that inhabit it.
That is a genuine differentiator about Extinction Rebellion. There are many differentiators in the historical span of organizations that have taken up the cudgels, but that's a really important part of it. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I would recommend going and looking at some of the things that Roger Hallam says, and some of the recordings of interviews with him, because it becomes really apparent from those where he sees the need for a spiritual dimension for this kind of work to succeed.
Yes, I think it's more on the political side and the spiritual side that Roger may have some contrary opinions.
Yes.
Or contrary, you know.
Yeah.
But thank you. I think it's interesting that the direct action, civil disobedience movement through history has often had that deep spiritual roots. And ultimately, if you're asking people to be really quite brave, to take big risks, to be that courageous, I think it does help to draw on a deeper spirituality. And I think it's very interesting the way XR have incorporated different faiths and also indigenous traditions and other sacred traditions, and kind of brought them all together into something which is very colorful, very distinctive, but actually really profound. A question, just since we've started talking about XR a little bit, I was interested in your book, Jonathan, that you talk quite explicitly about how you've worked through politics and through business and through NGOs of various kinds, and you almost come to the conclusion that actually it has to be now about mass movements and about civil disobedience. And I was wondering if you could say something about the journey that you've been on to end up there, and a little bit about that, the civil disobedience in particular.
Thanks, Jeremy. Well, it's certainly a circular journey for me, that's for sure, because the start of my journey was back in 1974 when I joined the Green Party, and have been involved in radical campaigning from that point on. But from the Earth Summit onwards, 1992 onwards, I've spent a huge amount of my life working with business and working with government and trying to accelerate the pace of change and persuade reluctant parties to this cause to get moving faster and just do things at a deeper level. So that's been, for the last 25 years, that's really been my principal route to trying to bring about change faster in this fractured world. But when you do the analysis, and writing Hope in Hell, I had to go back in and revisit the science and get myself completely up to speed with exactly what the science was telling us and what it wasn't telling us, and to try and do that as conscientiously as I could, instead of just absorbing the latest report or study, whatever it might be. So having got my head around that, and then you look at where the politicians are in terms of the responses they bring to bear to that science, and of course it is that gap between our knowledge of the state of the earth today and all of these really quite scary indications that we now have of feedback loops and tipping points in different natural systems and so on, and the gap between that and the political response. And the gap is still enormous. That isn't to say politicians aren't doing stuff, that they are, but it is in no way proportionate to what we now know about accelerating climate impacts in the world today. So, simple question to everybody: how do we narrow that gap? And the idea that 10 more years of incremental engagement of the sort that we've had over the last 10 years quite obviously will not narrow the gap. We know that. And actually, that's why 2019 was such an important year, because during 2019, not just XR, but the amazing inspirational power of young people erupted in the midst of this whole debate and began to point out to people that this was so deeply immoral that the whole of the rest of their lives would be impacted devastatingly by accelerating climate change. So the gap isn't going to narrow by just going on doing what we've done for the last X years. So for me, that then gets logical and deeply personal. It means that we need to bring forward a number of different ways of narrowing the gap, including mass civil disobedience, including support for organizations like XR, non-violent direct action, which of course is from the circular bit, because that goes back to the Green Party, which I think is the only political party in the UK that actually has written into its statutes support for the use of non-violent direct action as and when it feels that is the only way to bring about change in society. And that was always, for me as a member of the Green Party for all these years, that's still been a very important part of what it stands for today.
Thank you. On the theme of civil disobedience, while we're kind of talking about it, Cleo, I had a question for you, because in the last few months, possibly the most iconic example of civil disobedience that we've had is the tearing down of the Edward Colston statue, which happened in your city, in Bristol. And it was a really powerful moment that I think probably traveled all around the world. And certainly in the UK, it's one of the most powerful moments of the Black Lives Movement in this country. And I suppose I was interested in whether you've seen anything locally that's moving from that symbolic moment into more substantial change. Has that cracked open something?
I think it has cracked open a number of things, and it has highlighted how disillusioned people have become with authority, if you like, the inaction of authority, or the inability to hear the direction of travel and thoughts of a large section of its citizens. So I guess it did highlight, trying to do things the right way often means that no change happens. And just reflecting as an aside on some of the comments that have just been made kind of makes me feel that, isn't it a shame that the legal system or lawmakers and institutions can't take direct action to actually instigate some serious change? Why are we all still stuck in this kind of prison of theories and policies and things that have led us to where we are and keep us where we are? It's frustrating to say the least. I think what else is happening, and again, something that XR is kind of leading with, is the idea of the Citizens' Assembly. And really key is how we do, whilst, civil disobedience, or however you want to frame it, will have its place, how do we also galvanize people to still try to engage in the right way, but to come forward in larger numbers? And I guess as another aside, I have been doing what I can to try and encourage people who never engage politically to actually try to get involved, whether that's just submit a statement or a question at full council. I do believe, things like air quality within my city, we're often thrown the line that, well, at the moment it's only really privileged people who are making a fuss about it. And does that mean that it takes, working class people and people of colour to also take the direct action before some of our administrations are going to act? If it does, then that's what we must do. But I do feel that, yeah, there's a climate for change within my city. And as you said, it has ricocheted worldwide. And I think amongst younger people, we've seen it with the school strikes for climate, that these younger generations coming up who perhaps have had gaps in activism since perhaps the 70s, that there is this new wave, and that actually some of these younger generations will not tolerate some of the things that we've kind of been stuck with tolerating. And I'm sure it's, quite encouraging in some ways for people like Jonathon, who've been long-standing activists in this area, to actually see that now we are seeing some shifts, but it's taken decades. But hopefully it's taken decades, but now we'll see a radical, quick push that we all need. So I'm hopeful, but I'm not under any illusion of the groundwork that still needs to happen.
Thank you. That's interesting. I think one of the most powerful things about a moment of direct action like that is, there were all those campaigns for years around the Colston statue that didn't deliver, as you say. And then through one moment, you take the action yourself and it's done, just like that. And it can't help but send a message that actually maybe we're capable of more than we thought. Maybe it's to do with people who are standing in the way of something that's actually quite easy. And we've mentioned imagination a few times in the course of the evening already. And I wonder if we can talk a bit more about imagination, because that was a moment where you realize what's possible. The thing with talking about imagination during a global pandemic is, of course, that we're all on high alert. Everyone's a little bit stressed. I know that when I talk to my friends, and I feel it myself as well, there is this level of stress and almost of sort of mental and emotional bandwidth that we're all sort of heavily taxing at the moment. We're constantly watching out for how the rules are changing, what we're able to do and not able to do. That's changing all the time. And it feels like it's quite difficult to raise our imaginations and to think beyond where we are at the moment. It's almost like, let's get back to normal, then we'll get on to questions about justice, questions about climate, all that kind of thing. So I wonder, this is a question to everyone on the panel really, is how do we use the pandemic and the experiences that we've all had to one degree or another over the last 2 or 3 months to pull us forward and to imagine something else. Who wants to go first?
Well, it's a challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
It is a challenge, and sometimes running against the gauntlet that is the media. And I think imagination is really important. But again, it can be, if you can't imagine it, then it's unlikely to happen. So it is about trying to dig deep and create that imagination. For example, I often reflect, well, how can people relate to clean air and the benefits that it will have on things like mental health? If someone has always grown up in an area that is polluted, they cannot experience something else. And so it's hard to imagine or even appreciate the benefit that it will have on them. So yeah, can you repeat your question? Because I'm going off on the tangent here.
Well, yes, it was just to say that a time of pandemic, everyone's quite stressed, and it can be quite difficult to call people's imagination to something beyond the pandemic. And that all other issues kind of get put to one side as like, well, let's sort out this, and then we'll come back to climate change. But there's such an opportunity. I suppose we're being forced into making changes on an almost weekly basis about what we can do and can't do. And if we don't think now about how these changes can be used to make a better and more sustainable world, then there's a good chance that we'll come out of the pandemic having made things worse. And we know that's the default option in our system. When power acts, it reinforces inequalities unless deliberate steps are taken to do something different. So I suppose my question, and I partly the theme of the whole weekend, I think, is to say, how can we use our current circumstances to bring something better out of that on the other side? It is difficult. That's why it's worth having a whole weekend to talk about it.
Right. And of course, it relates to political will.
Yeah.
And without a change in the political system, it's going to be very hard to see some of the changes that I hope many of us would love to see. Because as you've highlighted, anything can happen. And if something needs to happen or the people in power deem that it's necessary, it could happen overnight. So it is, at least people perhaps have had that understanding that things can happen at a click of a finger if there's the political will. I think something also that has come to light is that people have seen how COVID has disproportionately affected, for example, people of colour. And maybe now a more wider demographic can actually appreciate the reality of inequality, when perhaps before it was maybe just a complaint or just someone, pulling a race card. But now it's very hard to deny the reality that's been brought in front of all of us through this situation.
Yeah. Jonathan, what do you think about imagination at a time of pandemic?
Yeah, I think I love that idea. I actually think probably more important than imagination at this time is just absolutely flat out political reality, because I think it is quite likely that we will come out of this pandemic with inequalities reinforced rather than addressed in a different way. I've been absolutely amazed at this debate about the standoff between Andy Burnham and Boris Johnson in terms of the package for Manchester, which at one level is all about £5 million. And you just think, really £5 million when we're spending billions at the drop of a hat? How can this possibly be? But of course, when you dig into it, it's about a very different view of what the money from the government, from the state, so our money, not the government's money, should go to support. And Andy Burnham's quite clear, it should be supporting the livelihoods and survival conditions for a lot of very poor people, not poor necessarily, but people in Manchester who are suffering appallingly. When you're on minimum wage and you're suddenly told you've only got 2/3 of minimum wage, this is not a good prospect. I'm intrigued at the speed with which the government having once told us that there was now a money tree, and there were money trees all over the place that we hadn't seen before, and everything was suddenly going to be doable, bit by bit, this government is reverting to a state of mind that isn't going to go back to austerity, but it's going back to balancing the budget again. You can hear this creeping into a lot of the rhetoric now. And there is no way of coming out of COVID-19 with a clearer emphasis on essential workers, on genuine equality, on addressing some of the issues thrown up during the course of the COVID-19 crisis. As Cleo was just saying, there's just no way, if we're still going to play at balancing budgets economics. It just can't be done. So right now, I'm kind of enjoying the prospect of being able to do some more imaginative work, but I think there's a hell of a lot of really hard-nosed politics to be done for the foreseeable future to ensure that we do actually avoid that outcome.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think another example alongside what's happening in Manchester is what's been happening with the school meals.
Yeah,
with holidays
exactly.
Situation. And right before we started, a friend of mine texted me and said, you should have a look at Marcus Rashford's Twitter feed, which I did. And it is quite extraordinary in that, you know, the Parliament voted not to pay the 20 million to feed children on school meals during the holiday. And what's happened instead is all these different councils have said, well, we're going to do it. And then cafes have said, well, we're going to make free food available for children. And you look at Marcus Rashford's Twitter feed at the moment, and it's just dozens and dozens and dozens of groups and private businesses who are coming forward and saying, well, we will feed people.
Yeah.
And I think that's quite a remarkable act of correcting it, I suppose. You say, like you say, there is a political element to that. The government is doing this, but this is what's right, and we're going to do it anyway. Melanie, did you have anything to add on sort of the moment we find ourselves in and how we can think differently and take things forward?
I agree completely with what both you've just said and with what Jonathan and Cleo have said. And actually I have a question to ask them, but let me just say that I think there are two things, and they're separate things. One is that we can imagine how we as civil society can step into the gaps and how we can help to imagine a world that we do things differently. But it will only be plugging gaps, and it won't be a solution to the difficulties, because what is needed, as both Cleo and Jonathan pointed out, is political will. So the question that I'd like to ask both of them, because they've both been involved in the fray of politics, is how we can get politicians to change their minds, how we can persuade them to reimagine this world, and particularly the politicians that we find in power today. Because there must be some way in which we can influence that debate, because I'm not prepared to give up on that.
Cleo, do you want to take that first?
I'll hand it over to you, Jonathan.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you're not giving up on it, Melanie, because we definitely can't give up on it. I think that actually the story is that the world that they have been so used to inhabiting is changing around them. And this whole story about the Rashford and the school lunches is such a powerful reminder that people will no longer go along with this idea that we have to do this because of fiscal discipline or whatever it might be. It just won't any longer be available to them. Now, how many of them learn that lesson? You would have thought that having had to do one about turn on school lunches at the behest of Marcus Rashford, that they wouldn't need to be put in that same position again, especially when the amount of money involved is relatively small. But we are dealing with some seriously deep ideological problems here, Melanie. In fact, when you asked that question, it took me back to the wretched David Cameron and all of his utterly spurious, flatulent enthusiasm for the big society. Some of you, I'm sure, will remember that period of Cameron politics when it was all about people stepping up to make things work in their community and make things work for the disadvantaged and so on, quite clearly from an ideological perspective, as a substitute for government, for the state being as involved as they should be in ensuring that there are minimum conditions in all of our public services, that these sources of injustice, of racial inequality, are addressed first and foremost at the state level. Now, I can't answer your question, Melanie, because the only hope in this current Conservative Party are the large number of MPs who've been elected from the so-called red wall seats, former Labour seats, who must, sorry, I don't want you to think I'm enjoying this thought, but I am, who must this weekend be thinking to themselves, what the bloody hell is going on in number 10 and number 11, because Rishi isn't doing quite as well as he was to begin with. What is going on? Do they not understand what happened when Labour voters decided to entrust their vote to a Conservative government, and how easily that could be lost? So for me, over the next 4 years, oh God, I hate saying that, over the next 4 years, that is going to be the leverage point, is to try and shift some of those deep ideological commitments to small government, to non-state solutions to these problems, market-based solutions. The whole reason why we're in such a mess with our test and trace, as you know, is because it was given to the private sector rather than worked through public health authorities on a local basis. That's genuinely the principal reason why our test and trace system is an utter fiasco from top to bottom.
Yeah, I think I would just add to that by reiterating that, of course, we need electoral reform, we need a fairer voting system. And also, I agree perhaps that, well, we can review how we think devolution is going, with more local decision making and, of course, local tax raising, whether it's business rates, etc., being held more locally, whether that will give local authorities, the ability to make better decisions. I guess one thing that has frustrated me is, this idea that, and it has been good to see some of the things that have occurred over the last week with a push from local authorities and regions to get a better deal for the desperate situation that they're in. That is encouraging, because quite often in local authorities, when we pass our annual budget, it's this idea of, well, none of us are happy to be agreeing to this budget by and large. Through austerity, it's been a very, very difficult period, and I do not envy anyone who is in the majority ruling party on a local council. It's a virtually impossible job. But what we do not see enough of is, if you like, leaders taking the argument a little further to national government. There's a massive fear of doing that. And it's something that I think we need to get over and just have a go, basically. I think, I always like to see and look for the good in people. Whilst I am horrified by a lot of the decisions that are coming from central government, I sometimes think to myself, but do these people really know what they're doing? They're clearly very out of touch from everyday life. And it seems that we are being governed in many ways by people who are quite greedy, to say the least, and perhaps still hold a very dated view that any misfortune people have is somehow their own fault, and that they completely lack any sense of empathy, when I guess most of us with empathy will know that the world and our country does not have a level playing field, and that the vast majority of people do not have things like institutional wealth, which many of the people leading the country do have, And when we talk about privilege, something that I have thought a lot about recently is that there are people who have all this inherited wealth, I should say, not institutional, but inherited wealth. They have inherited wealth, yet they're still wanting more. It's never enough. They'll perhaps still be a CEO or be in a governmental position or a consultant, taking a lot of our taxpayers' money. and it's never enough. And that has to stop. And I think, you know, with all these topical debates, including toppling statues, it's about, and we are seeing change, it's about that move to topple these old, outdated systems that really do not serve the majority of us, as we know. These, and also this comes in line with what are actually deadly conventions. And whilst perhaps not deadly, I did come across a lot of these conventions whilst again being Lord Mayor. And you think, well, why on earth is this happening? And it's just because it always has. No one's questioned it. Some people might have thought twice about it, but it's what is how it is here. So when will we get to a point where it no longer is how it is here? Because surely it can't go on. But of course, with this debate as well, with, you know, confronting our painful past, which still is rearing its head today, how do we go forward when the reality is a good proportion of our tax money, our money, is still going towards things like the royal family? And how do we also confront their role in our imperial past? These are difficult questions, but these are probably necessary questions so that we can actually go forward in a way that is equitable for people and planet.
Yes, and that that brings me to a question that we've had from in the comments there from Mike. And he says, is there a risk that declaring a climate or ecological emergency could deprioritize other matters, for example, oppression and racism? And how can we proceed so that all of these critical issues are considered together? And I think that's something that you've just touched on there a little bit. It's something as well that I know XR have been challenged on in the past, of making sure that issues of justice are front and center. When we're talking about our grandchildren, for example, and about animals and nature, how do we remember that during the climate emergency, there are some people who are already suffering now, and there's this massive justice issue. I don't know if you'd like to talk about that, who'd like to have a go at that, about how we bring together environmental issues and issues of justice.
I'm happy to have a go at that.
Great.
What I would say is that there needs to be a recognition that these aren't separate problems. It's all a web of issues that are interconnected. They're completely intersectional, and that the climate crisis is both caused by some of these, but also amplifies the problems that we have. And without tackling them all, we can't tackle any one of them. So we know, for instance, that the climate crisis has particularly adverse effects on people who are already marginalized. We know that it has gender impacts. So we need to address both of those in order to address the effects of the climate crisis. But we also know that if we don't address the climate crisis, we can't address those adequately. So yeah, it has to be all one, not individually looked at.
Yeah. Jonathan, I know that you've used almost exactly the same phrase of it being two sides of the same coin in your book. Maybe you could add something to that as well.
Yeah, I absolutely. But I think let's just cheer ourselves up for a moment, just in case we're all getting a tiny bit gloomy here. One of the most astonishing things that happened in 2019, so before COVID, was this new sense of the interconnectivity between all of these different issues. I mean, when you look at what young climate activists, they call themselves climate activists, but when you look at the nature of their campaigning, climate justice is the essence of it. And for them, there isn't a sense that you've got one bucket of stuff over here that's called climate change, another bucket over here called social justice, another bucket called racial inequality, whatever it is. There is I'm not sure I like the word terribly much, but this notion of intersectionality is there in practice. And I think it's true, as Melanie's just pointed out, I think it's also true that XR has worked its way through to that actually very impressively. So for me now, despite the fact that the UK never really had an environmental justice movement. Unlike the USA, which has always had an influential, not very powerful, but a sort of quietly influential environmental justice movement, never embraced, by the way, by the rich northern white NGOs. Sorry to spell it out bluntly, I haven't got time to do the whole history of the environmental justice movement in the USA, but it never got embraced by the powerful elite conservation NGOs in Washington. But in the UK, we never really had this movement at all. So now I'm finding that there is a much clearer understanding of this. So if you just look, for instance, very quickly, Jeremy, if you look, for instance, at the wording of the new bill that is being promoted by a number of different organizations, including XR, the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill. Well, one, you've got the first pairing, climate and biodiversity. And then when you look at the actual wording, the wording is full of references to what you would call minimum social justice commitments and the need to honor that in every single new measure that is taken in a rich world country like the UK. So having lived most of my life where people did not see these things as absolutely inextricably interconnected, I am celebrating this newfound readiness to integrate through action. And that is even more powerful than integrating in words.
Yes, I would second that, actually. I've been working on a new book on climate change and racism and putting those together. And so I've been doing a lot of research on it over the last 3 years. And one of the things that struck me was that there is so much more material in the States than there is in this country. And you've got the environmental justice movement and people like Robert Bullard who've been talking about this, a generation. And what's really exciting, and this, like you say, is a very positive thing, is that there is a younger generation that just really gets it. And they are now beginning to take power. And so you've got people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Green New Deal that she's written with other people, and the way that it combines social justice and environmental justice and aggressive action on climate change. It's absolutely exemplary. And if you want to be encouraged, actually, I would recommend just going and reading the American Green New Deal legislation. It's one of the most readable pieces of legislation you'll find anywhere. And it's exactly the kind of thing that we want to see happening and that young people support. And you think if you fast forward 10, 15, 20 years, you might have someone like Ocasio-Cortez as president in the US. We may have similar figures in Britain coming forwards. Things do look a lot more positive looking forwards. Another thing that just to mention quickly is I read this really good book last week called, it's gone from my head already, Diversifying Power by Jenny Stevens. And it's about feminist and anti-racist leadership in climate change. And what's really great about that is that she has all these different stories of people who are demonstrating anti-racist and feminist forms of decision-making, and also loads of policy ideas. So the kinds of policies you would bring to the table if you wanted to do things that will improve sustainability and equality at the same time. So just to give one example of that, if you're looking at sustainable transport, you look at mass transit rather than electric cars. Electric cars, they're expensive, they're for the rich first. They don't do anything about traffic. They don't do anything for those who can't afford a car. If you look at mass transit and you're looking at sort of trams and buses and those sorts of things, you have all the benefits of the sustainable transport network, but you also benefit those who are marginalized. And there's so many other examples you can look at in terms of policy where you get. So
Jeremy, can you stick the link for that in the chat, because that sounds really helpful.
Yes.
Really useful. It's
yes, I will.
And I guess there really are implications there, aren't there, for the ways in which faith groups in general, but thinking particularly about the source of this festival, how Christians who've taken such a strong, pronounced view on many of these issues over many, many years, this speaks very directly to the ways in which they can now continue to contribute to these debates, continue to provide that kind of servant leadership. And I'm very struck by that because in a way, sometimes those voices aren't heard as loudly as they might be. I mean, there's a whole wonderful example of a green Christian approach towards alternative taxation systems and how important it is. I was just reading the other day about the Zacchaeus tax movement, pressing really hard for taxes on wealth, for taxes on financial transactions, for taxes on carbon and other polluting industries. And sometimes, I hope this isn't going to be too controversial, but sometimes there's a sort of hesitancy about the way in which Christians, green Christians, campaign for these things, as if all of that stuff about fiscal reform is somehow not really part of the story. But it really is part of the story, because you can't do the climate justice and the social justice narrative without all of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Jeremiah. That's a really fascinating example.
To pick another question from the floor, got a question from Sylvia here, who says, don't we have to backtrack on our standard of living? We have to take a lower standard for the way we live. People simply cannot believe that less clutter, possessions, etc., could mean more satisfaction, more free time, and more opportunity to enjoy the natural world. Anybody want to comment on sort of the balance between personal actions and this sort of broader systemic change that we've been talking about? How do we fit those two together?
Yeah, well, it's obviously all important, but I think there should be an emphasis on corporations and institutional level of change, which, if we can push it enough, will achieve greater change and quicker. So I think that's where the majority of the onus should be. But I do agree that we can all make individual changes, individual choices. But I think, again, going back to the idea of consumerism and materialism, the Green Party has done well, and others, of course, in the last year and beyond, to really promote the idea of well-being and happiness as an indicator of success. And I do notice as well, as a local councillor, being on, involved in audit committees and things like that, that even auditors are now starting to slowly embed the idea of well-being and these other factors to look at holistic outcomes that do go beyond just monetary measures. So I think those things are important as well, for us to be able to slowly shift away from the idea that accumulating personal wealth and accumulating things is the end goal. And I do hope, again, with the number of young people who are becoming, politically active, if you like, that they can also go some way to lead on this, okay? Because we know things like fast fashion, they are having catastrophic effects on climate. So again, if we can encourage and ensure that the education is there from a young age, but again, we're up against it, because even, the last few months, there have been many calls, for example, to diversify the curriculum, including petitions that have gone to government and have received hundreds of thousands of signatures, and have kind of received a wishy-washy response from government saying that, well, teachers are kind of free to teach what they want, so no, we're not actually going to put this in. But as a reaction, I believe, to that call, those calls, we've now had soundings coming out saying that, well, actually, the government is not happy for any school to be teaching anything that can be deemed anti-capitalist. So that has to be factored in, that we really are up against it, because surely for us to realise this promised land, it has to be anti-capitalist.
Yeah. Well, that brings me to another question that I saw pop up earlier, which was that, Jonathon, you wrote a book called Capitalism as If the World Matters, which was, when was that, 15, 20 years ago? I remember reading it fresh out of university. And the question that Mark had asked was, how has your thinking evolved on capitalism since that book and Hope in Hell?
Crikey. Okay. Well, I like Cleo's absolutely definitive comment there that any sensible version of a promised land with all the justice and compassion and sustainability that would mean is incompatible with capitalism, and at least that's completely clear. I wrote that book to try and actually work out in my own mind whether it was possible for any version of capitalism to be the means by which we arrived at that promised land, since that's what we're talking about here. And in the end, I sort of, to my own, if nobody else's satisfaction, came to the conclusion that if one actually transforms the essence of a capitalist system, so you can still hang on to the idea that there are market-based economies, people can make profit, but only to a certain point. Nobody can accumulate wealth as people do today. And of course, we've already had a reference to the invidious impact of capital accumulation on the economy. If you do all of these reforming things to make capitalism meet the needs of our time, both from a climate and a social justice point of view, then it's possible that a market-based economy could get us there. But most people wouldn't call that capitalism. And then you're down to a kind of terminological story that if you really strip away all the truly dreadful aspects of capitalism that cause the problem today, and you do legislate for the getting rid of all of those parts, are you left with something that is still capitalist? Question mark. In the eyes of many, no. But if you want to get transformation without scaring the life out of any politicians who still subscribe to capitalism being the only means by which we'll ever do anything in this world today, then you might look to the radical transformation of capitalism rather than the getting rid of capitalism as a precursor to creating the conditions for a promised land. That's still my pragmatic view, I must be honest.
I have a friend in Australia called Samuel Alexander who says we don't need to fight capitalism, we need to compost capitalism. Just ignore it until it rots away. It's kind of his.
I like that.
But what you mentioned, the word sort of arriving somewhere, and the idea of a promised land as well. And so my own contribution to this debate is the book The Economics of Arrival, which I wrote with my friend Catherine Trebek, who's a leader in the well-being economics movement. And the idea that we had in that book was that in conventional economics, the view of progress is this endless upward curve of growth and progress. And you take off and economic growth just goes forever. And if you're one of those people who feels that you haven't had your fair share of that economic growth, well, then just sit down and be patient, because it will trickle down to you. And we won't worry about the fact that actually we don't have enough resources to provide a consumer lifestyle for all 7.5 billion of us in the world. And so what we argue instead is that certainly for rich countries like Britain, the challenge of the 21st century is to bring that journey to its destination and to arrive in the place where we find ourselves, and to stop thinking about where we're going and the sort of endless path to nowhere, and think, well, actually, no, we're here. We have arrived in this place. How do we make ourselves at home in this place and live as if we mean to stay? And that was our attempt to bring something of a different narrative, that idea of progress. And one thing that's positive about that as well is that I've been quite involved in the degrowth or the post-growth movement, which can be quite confrontational in that it challenges ideas of growth, but it doesn't necessarily offer a positive alternative. And so an idea of arrival would be to say, actually, coming to the end of growth is a positive thing. You've made it, in a sense. You might need to go backwards towards sustainability, but fine. It's actually a success story that you've grown enough and you've grown up. And that's something we all want to aspire to, is to see to grow and then to reach a period of maturity. That's been my own little contribution.
No, That's a lot. Makes a lot of sense, Jeremy. A lot of sense.
Melanie, did you have anything that you wanted to add on the topic of capitalism or growth?
I personally don't think that you can get rid of capitalism wholesale. I think you'd have to modify it. I don't think it would be acceptable. I think it's possibly quite a risky political process if you look at the world as a whole, but certainly some kind of mixed economy or a capitalism that has considerable constraints on it. I think one of the things that is difficult for human beings is the concept of not having private ownership. And once you begin to get private ownership, you begin to need to look at some sorts of market economies. That doesn't necessarily have to be capitalist, but I think people find it difficult to imagine a market economy that doesn't have some kind of roots in capitalism. So I'd say a mixed economy with considerable guidance. But I was intrigued by the question about accepting a lower standard of living, because I think that in truth is probably one way of describing it, what is necessary. We in the richer industrialized world have more than our fair share, and in order to make a more equitable world, growth is not necessarily the answer. In fact, it's definitely not the answer if we want to protect the earth. There needs to be a more equitable sharing. But rather than talk about a lower standard of living, I'd like to think of the concept of a different standard of living, because we can discover some really good things about it that's not kind of lower, just different. And in that we can discover relationship and community and time. You know, the whole idea of the long view and of thinking about others is a real benefit to a society that had to give up its consumption production paradigm. There are lots of other things, being able to spend time in nature, which we know actually has huge benefits for health. So yeah, I'd like to say it's not a lower standard of living, it's a different standard of living, but it is necessary.
I think that's a really good point, because one of the main problems we have with consumerism is that we've been given a definition of success which really doesn't satisfy, and which is based around commercial priorities rather than what we know to be fulfilling as human beings. And that to pursue progress as acquiring possessions is ultimately a never-ending treadmill that doesn't get us anywhere. And if we were able to redefine what progress means for us, so that it's much more based around things like healthy communities and rewarding work and lifelong learning and active citizenship and all those sorts of things, we could find that there are any number of ways to improve life with or without economic growth, with or without capitalism, because we're actually, those aren't the things that we're pursuing as a goal in themselves. We know what's most worthwhile, and we pursue those for themselves because they're good. I'm aware that we're getting towards the end of our time. We've got a few more minutes. I was wondering whether there's anything that you would like to raise that we haven't covered at all, that you'd like to talk about. We've covered a lot of ground. There's no doubt about that.
Jeremy, are you asking the speakers?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, sorry. I've got a couple more questions here otherwise that have cropped up. So there's nothing pressing from the panel. We've got a couple of questions here. We've got time for these ones as well. So a question from Ellen that says, nobody's mentioned the prevailing narrative of security, that we put our trust in militarism and conflict. How relevant is the waste of Earth's resources and peace to holding back a reimagined future?
I'm very happy to jump in there, if that's all right, yes, because sorry, this isn't a plug for the book, but there is a whole section on that in the book, because actually it astonishes me that we don't really talk about the role of militarism. I'm not talking about armed forces, as it were, but militarism in our midst. We don't talk about the massive expenditure every year on weapons that everybody hopes won't have to be used, but very often they are. And either way, that's an evil, because they're either being used or they're not, and all the resources and the money has been spent. And we certainly don't talk about the carbon footprint or the net resource take that goes on to produce these weapons of war. And it is absolutely enormous. So I kind of, this is going back to this point about intersectionality. If we don't put peace and a demilitarized world into this notion of a more integrated worldview, then we're definitely short of one of the biggest changes which will need to happen. And I guess that's why I'm still very active in campaigning against the arms trade and CND and the anti-nuclear movement, because here in this country, we're still, unfortunately, caught up in all kinds of nuclear fantasies, which means that we can't really come up with the sort of energy policy that we really need. So the difficulty is that this notion of militarism generates profits for companies, which generate dividends for their shareholders. And at the end of the day, that's usually why governments think we must defend these interests at all costs.
I think there's a point here about feminist leadership as well, in that there's no escaping the fact that carrying big weapons is very much a male thing. And if we had if we had greater representation of women in politics, I think we could do a lot better than that. And as a positive example, the country of Costa Rica, which is an example on the environmental front, has existed without an army, I believe, since the 1940s. It just doesn't have any armed forces. They did away with it. And as a deliberate sign to the world to show that you can do without them, that there is a dividend there that you can pass on to future generations, and that you're going to pursue peace rather than try and show off how well armed you are. Anything else on peace from Melanie or Cleo?
Yeah, I think there are two problems. One is that the whole issue of war, weapons, militarism is part of the consumption production paradigm. It's become business. And that, I think, drives a lot of the kind of militaristic processes that we see certainly in this country. We're a big arms producer and we sell it and it's a profit. But I think the other issue is that we still find politics to be rooted in a sense of othering. So there's a tribalistic element to politics, and it's a really unhealthy one. And when we can stop othering in all sorts of areas of our lives, but particularly in this one, I think we will see a real benefit in that. But that's a social issue as much as a governmental issue. And each of us has to look at the way in which we other people, we other concepts that we don't understand, that we other nature. You know, there's this whole dualistic thinking that promotes that the industry of war.
Yeah, I think I would just follow on from what's being said, really, that Britain really does have a legacy of having a really big ego, and in many ways is the ultimate small island. Of course, Greens support divestment from Trident, and on another, basic level, as Green Party councillors, we always wear white poppies. Many of us wear the red and the white, and sometimes that's caused issues. And again, as Lord Mayor, many people within the Green group of councillors didn't want to put themselves forward to be considered to do that role because many of them are anti-military. But for me, I really thought it was a great opportunity to get into different circles and understand more and talk to people. So echoing Melanie, I think communication is really, really important, particularly with people who seem to have opposing views. Because even with the white poppy, my view was, well, let me actually take the opportunity to speak to veterans and see what their view is. And every single one I spoke to did not have a problem with wearing the white poppy, preferably alongside the red. But it was important to have that dialogue rather than carry the line that someone had fed me of, oh, well, that might be a problem and blah, 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 which again goes back to convention. And again, being able to meet brigadiers and all the rest of it and ask them open and honest questions, you know, and understand and hear about their experiences, for example, and the trauma they've experienced, for example, of having to save bodies in the sea with the refugee crisis, in inverted commas, situation, the pain and the trauma that people in our armed forces have to go through, you know. And again, part of this is convention, part of this is having the ability to say what people really think and be honest where they can, you know, because I think in many times, so many of people's honest feelings, thoughts, desires, wants, hopes for the world are kind of repressed. And that's obviously a huge issue and a huge barrier to our collective progress.
Thank you. We've got a couple more questions that we haven't had time to get to, but I think that's actually a really interesting point to end on, where you mentioned there about the importance of dialogue. And there's a saying that change moves at the speed of relationships, and that when we do take the time to meet people and listen to each other, that we do find actually that there's often no great conflict there, and a lot of it is assumed. And yes, dialogue and listening to each other is what we're going to be doing more of over the course of the rest of the festival as well. So we've reached the end of our time. We've covered, like I say, we've covered so much stuff there. There's all kinds of different topics. I hope that there are some threads there that we can continue to explore and pull out over the next couple of days. So I think it's up to me to say thank you to our panel. Thank you to Melanie and Jonathan and Cleo for taking part, and for all your wisdom this evening. Thank you to everyone who's joined in as well, and for your wisdom, and I look forward to seeing you again in the next couple of days. And I'm going to hand back to Deborah, I believe.
Yes, that's right. Can you hear me? Did I unmute myself? I did. Thank you. Well, I have just been overwhelmed with everything. It's just been such an amazing discussion. I was poised with questions that I was going to throw in. They weren't needed. They weren't needed at all. It was just an amazing discussion. So thank you to Cleo and to Melanie and to Jonathan and to James, wherever he is, and also to Jeremy, who's chaired this brilliantly. And if you don't, I forgot to introduce Jeremy at the beginning, so I'm really sorry. But Jeremy is a key member of Green Christian. He's an author and activist. He's the co-author of The Economics of Arrival, which was mentioned earlier. And he also runs a green blog called The Earthbound Report, which is really, really worth looking at.